On an unremarkable street in Derby, England, stood a house like any other, modest, worn, quietly blending into the fabric of its neighborhood. No one suspected that within its walls was a world of control, manipulation, and psychological domination, nor that it would become the epicenter of one of the most horrifying crimes in recent British memory. 6 children lost their lives in a house fire that shocked a nation. The man at the center of it all, Mick Philpott, wept on national television. He played the grieving father, the devastated victim. But beneath the public performance lay something else entirely. What really happened on Victory Road that night? Was it truly an act of desperation, or something far more calculated? Why did no one stop him, despite decades of red flags? And perhaps most unsettling, was he ever truly acting alone? This is more than a case file. It's a cautionary tale of institutional blindness, psychological control, and a terrifying question that still lingers in the shadows. How many others are hiding in plain sight? You're listening to a story that goes beyond fire and into the heart of darkness. If you're drawn to stories that uncover what lies beneath the surface, the untold, the unresolved, the uncomfortable truths, then subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. In the quiet neighborhoods of Derby, England, no one expected that inside a modest council house lived a man who would come to symbolize the ultimate failure of the system. His name was Mick Philpott, a father, a partner, a man who wore many masks. To the public, he was portrayed as a struggling parent, controversial but misunderstood. To those who lived with him, he was something else entirely, a controlling manipulator, a master of coercion, and, as some would later argue, the leader of a psychological cult built around power, fear, and dependency. Philpott's disturbing history began long before headlines caught up with him. At just 21 years old, he entered into a relationship with a 15-year-old girl named Kim Hill. When she attempted to leave him, he responded with unimaginable violence, stabbing her 27 times. She survived. He served only 3 years in prison. That decision, that short sentence, would ripple outward for decades, leaving devastation in its wake. Following his release, Philpott continued a pattern of targeting vulnerable young women. He groomed them, isolated them from their support systems, and exerted complete control. Over time, he established a highly unconventional household. 2 partners, Mairead Duffy and Lisa Willis, and eventually 11 children, all under the same roof. To the outside world, it looked like chaos. To Philpott, it was a kingdom, and he ruled it absolutely. Psychologists would later describe Philpott's behavior as consistent with a narcissistic sociopath. He demanded loyalty, submission, and obedience. Any challenge to his authority was met with emotional, physical, or psychological retaliation. He enforced a rigid hierarchy, exploiting every advantage, including the UK's welfare system, to maintain dominance. Each child brought more state benefits, more funding, more justification for control. But in 2012, that carefully crafted world began to collapse. Lisa Willis left. She took her 5 children and walked away from the toxic environment Philpott had created. For most, that would be a moment of reckoning. For Philpott, it was war. The loss of the children meant not only a loss of emotional control, but a significant financial blow. His reaction would become one of the most shocking crimes in modern British history. On May 11, 2012, at approximately 4 a.m., a fire broke out in the Philpott residence. Petrol had been poured through the letterbox and ignited while the family slept. Inside, 6 children, Jay, Jan, Jack, Jesse, Jaden, and Dwayne, were trapped upstairs. Despite desperate efforts by emergency services, all 6 perished from smoke inhalation. Their deaths devastated the community. Candlelight vigils were held. News crews arrived. And Mick Philpott stood before cameras, weeping. His grief appeared genuine. His performance was compelling. But as investigators began to dig deeper, inconsistencies emerged. Forensic evidence quickly ruled out the initial theory of an outside attack. In the days following the fire, secret recordings captured damning conversations between Philpott, Mairead, and family friend Paul Mosley. The plan, it seemed, had been to start a small, controlled fire to frame Lisa Willis. an attempt to portray Philpott as a heroic father rescuing his children, thereby regaining custody and benefits. But the fire spread faster than anyone anticipated. The children never stood a chance. The recordings were clear. Philpott knew what he'd done. In one moment, his voice trembling, he whispered, "It's my fault we lost our children." Not as a lament, but as an admission. In April 2013, justice arrived. Philpott, Mourned, and Mosley were all convicted of manslaughter. The nation watched as a man who once pleaded for sympathy on national television was led away in handcuffs. Philpott received a sentence of life in prison, with a minimum of 15 years. Mourned and Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years, but both were released on license after serving just half. Yet even in the aftermath of the trial, troubling questions remained. How did a man with a violent criminal past escape meaningful scrutiny for so long? Why were the red flags, domestic violence, grooming behavior, manipulation, repeatedly overlooked by law enforcement and social services? Despite multiple reports and warning signs, no substantial intervention occurred until it was far too late. Experts now argue that Philpott's household bore all the hallmarks of a cult dynamic, with himself at the center, orchestrating every relationship, every financial decision, and every emotional interaction. Those who lived with him were not partners. They were victims, trapped by fear, bound by control, and isolated from help. And yet, the story does not end with the convictions. There are lingering doubts, details that don't align. Some investigators quietly suspect that more individuals may have known about the plan. Others believe there are pieces of evidence that never saw the light of a courtroom. To this day, some who were close to the case insist that not everything has been revealed. Mick Philpott is serving time, but the broader system that enabled him, that failed to stop him, has never truly been held accountable. And perhaps most unsettling of all is this. If a man like Philpott could hide in plain sight for decades, how many others are doing the same? This is more than a story of one man's evil. It's a cautionary tale, a portrait of institutional blindness, of ignored warning signs, and of lives lost not just to fire, but to failure. But the final question remains unanswered. Did Mick Philpott act alone? Or is the real truth still out there, waiting to be uncovered? What if he wasn't alone? The house on Victory Road has long been boarded up, its walls scorched by fire and grief, but the story that began there hasn't ended. In the years following the convictions of Mick Philpott, Mourned Duffy, and Paul Mosley, the case has remained in the public consciousness, not just for its horror, but for what it revealed and what it may still be hiding. Because while the headlines faded, questions did not. Why did it take the deaths of 6 children for authorities to take Mick Philpott seriously? Behind bars, Philpott remains unrepentant. In interviews, he alternates between denial and deflection. At times, he blames Lisa Willis. At others, the media. Rarely, if ever, does he show remorse. Psychologists have noted the absence of empathy, a hallmark of sociopathy, and suggest that Philpott's version of reality has always been one where he is the victim, never the perpetrator. But what if Philpott's story is bigger than just Philpott? In the course of their investigation, detectives uncovered disturbing behavior patterns, not just from Mick, but from those around him. Neighbors had heard arguments. Witnesses had seen bruises. Social workers visited the house multiple times. And yet, no one intervened with lasting impact. The question is no longer, why didn't anyone know? It's, why didn't anyone act? There's a word professionals use, bystander fatigue. It's the psychological phenomenon that occurs when repeated red flags are ignored because the system becomes overwhelmed, distracted, or desensitized. Philpott exploited that fatigue with precision, playing the system like a fiddle, mastering the role of the struggling dad, just trying to keep his family together. But if he was capable of orchestrating such a complex, horrific plan, was he truly acting alone? Paul Mosley, Philpott's longtime friend and accomplice, had a long history with the family. He wasn't just involved in the arson, he was a familiar face at the house, a participant in Philpott's world. Why? What did he gain from being involved? Did fear play a role? Or something else entirely? Mourned Duffy, too, remains a deeply complicated figure. Her involvement in the crime stunned the public. How could a mother participate in something that would put her own children at risk? During the trial, the prosecution argued she was manipulated, trapped in a psychological prison constructed by Philpott, but others questioned that narrative. Was she another victim, or an accomplice who enabled abuse for years? One former detective, speaking anonymously, put it bluntly: there were too many silences in that house. Too many people saw too much and said too little. And then there's a timeline. Several inconsistencies have never been publicly explained. CCTV footage that allegedly didn't match up. Witness statements that were redacted. One report claimed the fire burned too quickly to have ignited in the exact way described at trial. Arson investigators were confident, but not unanimous. For some, the science still leaves room for doubt. Was someone else there that night? Someone who left before emergency services arrived? If so, who? And perhaps more haunting, was this really the first time something like this had been planned? One former neighbor recalled hearing Mick discuss teaching Lisa a lesson weeks before the fire. Another described a disturbing comment about having too many mouths to feed. These statements were never used in court, deemed hearsay, but now, in retrospect, they raise alarms. Today, the Philpott case is used in criminology courses and social services reform workshops. It has become a symbol of institutional failure, of unseen abuse, of the illusion of normalcy. But it is also a warning about the dangers of charismatic predators who know how to manipulate systems designed to protect. Since Philpott imprisonment, other cases have emerged across the UK. Similar dynamics, similar patterns. The signs are always there. The question is whether anyone is looking closely enough to connect them. Because while Mick Philpott is behind bars, the conditions that allowed him to thrive still exist. Underfunded agencies, overloaded caseworkers, a system more focused on managing risk than preventing it. So we ask again, did Philpott act alone? Or is there someone out there, someone who helped, someone who watched, someone who knew, still walking free? And if they are, how long before we hear their name?